Hello, welcome to Hill and Ponton's YouTube channel. I am attorney Melanie Williams, and today I'm going to be walking you through a DBQ or a Disability Benefits Questionnaire. And this is the form that the C&P examiner is supposed to fill out when you do a C&P exam. And so we're going to be looking specifically at the DBQ for PTSD. Okay, so this is what the DBQ looks like. And again, this is what the C&P examiner usually fills out. You can also have your own doctor fill this out and then submit this to the VA. So we're going to go through it together. Okay, so we're going to start down in this section over here where they first ask, does the veteran now have a diagnosis of PTSD? And the examiner will indicate either yes or no. They're also going to indicate if you have any other mental disorder diagnoses. Then they're going to specifically address whether the other mental health diagnoses that you have impact your mental health, your PTSD, what other conditions you may have that are tied into your PTSD or mental health conditions. One of the things that they specifically look at is TBI. That's important because TBI tends to be confused with PTSD, and so they need to look at both of those conditions as well. And as they identify the other mental health diagnoses, they also need to be able to distinguish your symptoms, whether it's related to the PTSD or if it's related to another mental health disorder. And so they have to ask if it's possible to differentiate which symptoms are attributable to each diagnosis. Now, this may not be relevant to you at all. This sometimes the examiners will skip over this completely, but this usually comes in, for example, if you have depression, they will need to specify if the depression is due to the PTSD or if it's separate from the PTSD and what symptoms result from each condition. Or if they can't be differentiated, then they would say that they are inextricably intertwined, and so they can't be differentiated. And so, like I mentioned, this is where they ask about TBI, because again, that's one of the conditions that they would need to distinguish PTSD and TBI. So when we get to this section here, this is what the VA is going to base your rating on. So whichever one of these that the examiner indicates, that corresponds to a rating. We've got total occupational and social impairment, that's a 100% rating. Occupational and social impairment with deficiencies in most areas, that's a 70% rating. Occupational and social impairment with reduced reliability and productivity, that's a 50%. Then we've got 30%. 10%. And then if the mental condition has been formally diagnosed, but the symptoms are not severe enough to interfere with occupational or social functioning, that's a 0%. So whichever box they check here, 9 out of 10 times, that's the rating that the VA is going to assign. And the examiner is usually going to check a box depending on what symptoms you have. And we'll get to that in a second. Now, here we come down to the section where they're going to identify the evidence that they reviewed. They will indicate if they've reviewed the C file, and usually they always have. It's your service records, treatment records, any relevant portions, they'll identify those here. Then we come down to your history. So they're going to identify your relevant social, marital, family history. So a lot of times if the examiner asks you, tell me about your childhood, tell me about who you live with right now, are you married? This is the section where they will indicate that. They will also ask you about your occupational and educational history. And then finally, your mental health history. They may not ask you this specifically. Again, remember, we don't know exactly what the C&P examiner is going to do, how long they're going to take with you, but these are the sections that they are supposed to fill out. Then there's also your relevant legal history. So if you have any legal troubles in the past, your substance abuse history, these are all things that they're supposed to identify. And tie into or determine if it's tied into your mental health condition. Now, this is where we get to the PTSD diagnostic criteria. So, as they go through this section, this is what identifies whether or not you have a diagnosis of PTSD. So, they need to indicate your stressor, whatever your stressor is, they need to identify whether you directly experienced it, whether you witnessed it, whether you learned that it happened to a close family member, or if this criterion is not met. And so each criterion here is the different um, criteria that they look for a PTSD diagnosis. So they're going to ask you, or they should ask you, if you have intrusive memories of the event. Do you have recurring dreams about the event? Do you have other dissociative reactions, such as flashbacks, where all of a sudden you feel like you are back in your stressor and you've kind of lost touch with the present? Do you have intense or prolonged psychological distress? So basically, when you are exposed to something that reminds you of the traumatic event, how do you respond? Same thing, marked physiological reactions. So do you have a actual physical reaction to something that reminds you of the event? So, for example, if you suffered from military sexual trauma and now you have a hard time being around men, and so you may have a psychological response, or you may have a physical response where your body tenses up, or you start to feel pain in your chest, or things like that. This is what they're going to indicate to determine if you have a PTSD diagnosis, and you have to meet at least one of the criteria in this section in order to qualify for a PTSD diagnosis. Then we move on to the next section, criterion C. So that's if you have persistent avoidance of a stimuli associated with the event. So if you find yourself always trying to avoid thinking about the event, talking about the event, if you find yourself trying to avoid things that remind you of the event, like people, places, people talking about anything that relates to the trauma that you went through. And then again, in this section, you would have to meet either one or both of these in order to qualify for PTSD. Then moving on to criterion D, again, here you would have to meet two or more of the ones in this section. So we've got an inability to remember an important aspect of the traumatic event, persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs about yourself or the world. So, for example, I am bad, no one can be trusted, the world is completely dangerous, my whole nervous system is permanently ruined. So, any thoughts along those lines that are just very exaggerated general beliefs, that would qualify in this section. Persistent distorted cognitions about the cause or consequences of the trauma. Again, so leading you to blame yourself, or having some kind of, thinking every time I do this, something bad is going to happen because this is what happened when the stressor happened. Persistent negative emotional states, emotional sorry, persistent negative emotional state. So if you're always afraid, if you're always angry, if you have a less interest or participation in significant activities. So if you're no longer involved in your community, in church, in friendships, all of those things would count. Feelings of detachment or estrangement from others. So same thing, if you no longer have friends, if you no longer feel connected to your family, persistent inability to experience positive emotions. So you just no longer can feel happy. You don't have loving feelings towards anyone. Those all fall into this criterion. And so again, you would need to meet at least two of these in order to qualify for a diagnosis of PTSD. Then we move on to criterion E. You would also need to have two or more in this section. So if you have irritable behavior and angry outbursts, reckless or self-destructive behavior, hypervigilance. Remember, that's when you find yourself overly paranoid, always looking over your shoulder. I had one veteran who every time he would get into his car, he would have to walk all around his car, looking underneath the car to make sure there was nothing there. that's hypervigilance. Exaggerated startle response. So if when you hear a loud noise, all of a sudden you jump up or jump down to the floor, jump under a table, that's an exaggerated startle response. Problems with concentration, sleep disturbance. So again, if you have at least two or more of these, you qualify under that, under criterion E. Then under F, um, you have to have had these symptoms for more than 1 month. Under G, the symptoms have to affect your life, affect your social occupational areas of life. Basically, if you have these symptoms and it's impacting you, this would qualify under criterion G. And under H, it can't be attributable to anything else like alcohol or any other substance abuse. So if you meet all of the criterion in this section, then you would qualify for a diagnosis of PTSD. And these are separate from the symptoms that they use to determine your rating. These are the symptoms that they use to determine if you have a diagnosis. This next section is where they look at your symptoms. So they would check the box for which of these symptoms you meet: depressed mood, anxiety, suspiciousness. So hypervigilance would also correlate with suspiciousness, panic attacks and how often they occur, near continuous panic or depression affecting the ability to function independently, appropriately, and effectively. So this is where you're going to want to advocate for yourself and explain, how often do you feel like you're in a state of anxiety or depressed? How severe is it that you find yourself constantly worried? And again, that feeling of looking over your shoulder. You are the one that's going to be able to advocate for yourself and explain how often you feel this so that the examiner can find that it is near continuous. Because this criteria falls under the 70% criteria for PTSD. Then you've got chronic sleep impairment, mild memory loss, more severe memory loss, flattened affect, your speech, difficulty in understanding commands, impaired judgment, abstract thinking, gross impairment in thought processes or communication. So each of these corresponds to a different rating. So depending on what they find here is what they're going to check in that box that's going to tell the VA what rating they should assign you. So I would go through each of these symptoms and think about on a daily basis what you struggle with. So go through and write down every time you notice that you have impaired judgment, or you're not able to follow a conversation, or really communicate effectively. Does that fall under gross impairment of thought process or communication? Or if you have difficulty in establishing and maintaining work and social relationships, do you find yourself not having friends, not reaching out to people? Suicidal ideation. Remember, we've talked about in other videos that suicidal ideation doesn't necessarily mean that that you have a plan to commit suicide. It could mean having thoughts like, I wish I weren't here anymore. I wish I didn't wake up in the mornings. It would be easier for everybody else if I weren't here. Those count as suicidal ideations. And the VA, that corresponds to a 70% rating. So yeah, go through each of these symptoms and see what applies to you. Keep in mind that the examiner is not necessarily going to ask you about each and every one of these. They're going to take what you tell them and just check the box that they think applies. So it's up to you to explain and talk and tell them what it is that you go through, because they're not going to go through each and every one of these with you. So you need to know, you need to go into the exam knowing what you're going to tell them, what examples you're going to give, so that they can check the box and help assign a rating that way. Um, So then usually in behavioral observations, that's where they're going to talk about how you walked into the exam that day, what you're wearing, what you look like, what you sounded like, if you were able to communicate effectively. This is where they're going to write that down. They're going to This is a general box if there's any other symptoms that aren't listed above. So if there's something that doesn't that you experience that isn't necessarily covered by one of these boxes, you'll want to tell them about that, and this is where they would indicate that. Now, here they ask if you're capable of managing your financial affairs. Um, if they find that you're not, so if they find that you spend money recklessly, that you don't know how to pay your bills or how much your bills are, they're going to look for if you have someone in your life that does that for you, and if so, you're going to want to tell them. Um, Tell them that there is somebody that manages your finances for you, because if not, if they find that you are not able to manage your financial affairs, they will likely find you incompetent. And then there's a whole other proceeding that the VA would go through finding you incompetent. So make sure that if you're talking about that you're not able to handle your money well, make sure you mention to them if there is somebody that handles your money for you. Okay. Then here they would indicate any other remarks. Usually when it's a case for service connection, whether or not your PTSD is connected for service, there's a separate form or a separate document that they would fill out called a medical opinion. And that's where they would indicate if it's as at least as likely as not that your PTSD resulted from whatever happened in service. So that would be a separate document that we're not looking at today.